Dámy a pánové, vítám vás v Centru architektury a městského plánování. Moje jméno je Jiří Jaroš a provedu vás dnešním večerem přednáškou, na kterou bude navazovat i vernisáž České ceny za architekturu. Je to další přednáška ze série Urban Talks. My se v ní dlouhodobě věnujeme tématům, kterým se věnují zahraniční studia, to znamená prací zahraničních studií, zahraničních hostů, odborníků a tak dále. Někdy odborně, někdy jdeme více po povrchu, aby jsme vás seznámili s tím, co se v zahraničí děje. Dneska to bude možná více odborné, ale zase velice poslechově příjemné, protože dnešním hostem je Deyan Sudjic, který vlastně měl na starosti, byl hlavou Design muzea v Londýně a on je sice vystudovaný architekt, ale tvrdí, že není designér, není architekt, že se věnuje tomu, aby vysvětloval lidem, jak se na ty věci dívat, jak fungují, protože tvrdí, že design je vlastně způsob, jakým chápeme svět kolem nás. A on opravdu hezky formuluje ty myšlenky na otázky, co je design, co je architektura a tak dále, ty, které se těžko zodpovídají. Takže dneska se dozvíme určitě spoustu nového. Dnešní přednáška vzniká ve spolupráci s Českou cenou za architekturu. Takže tady rád přivítám Jana Kasla, který je předsedou České komory architektů a má nad celou akcí záštitu.
Dobrý večer, Jiří, děkuji. Takže už mám slovo rovnou, už můžu.
Určitě máte slovo, rád vás tady vidím.
Díky, dobrý večer. Já myslím, že bylo řečeno skoro všecko. Já v tomto okamžiku nemám moc co dodat. Deyan Sudjic byl naším porodcem 8. ročníku České ceny za architekturu v loňském roce. Původně jsme doufali, že ta přednáška se povede v rámci ještě loňského ročníku. Nebylo to možné, takže dnes je tady splněný odložený slib. A protože až po jeho skončení jeho přednášky se domluvíme více o 9. ročníku, tak já nebudu víc zdržovat a poprosím Deyan, would you be so kind and come to us and give your lecture?
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. It's scarily enormous, that sign, Deyan Sudjic. There's no escaping it. I can't hide. I really am here. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be in Prague. I mean, everyone says that, but actually, Prague is a great place to be. So I call my talk today, What Can Architecture Do? What do architects talk about when they talk about architecture? Well, usually they talk about their work, or themselves in some egotistical cases. But I'm not really an architect. I trained to be one. But in the wonderful words of the greatest architecture critic of them all, Clint Eastwood, it's important to know your limitations. And I realized when I was a student that I was both incompetent and impatient. So I became a journalist rather than an architect. In the British system, after 3 years, you spend a year in a studio. And I was lucky enough to work for the firm that built the Barbican, one of the great 60s landmarks in London, the Barbican estate with art gallery, theatre, concert hall, school, apartments. But I realized as soon as I'd arrived that no task that I was set by my job architect could I possibly carry out. I realized that the idea of architecture was something that had always been in my mind, but transforming that into physical reality was beyond me. But I really made me understand and admire those architects who can do it, and to understand what a strange and complex process the making of a building really is. I sometimes compare it to filmmaking. Both to make a film and to make a building require a strong creative idea, the silver-tongued plausibility to persuade someone to finance it, and also the confidence to stand on a construction site or a movie set surrounded by people who think that you might be an idiot and try to make them do what you want. But the question really is the architect the director in control of everything? Or are they the movie stars, which can get something greenlit? Well, occasionally, yes. Or are they the script writer who has their script written and rewritten until it's lost any relationship with the original idea. And I guess architects are a bit of all of those things. When I was studying architecture, of course, I did believe that one day I would be one. And when I became a journalist and then a critic and then an editor and then a curator, I'd always had that vague sense that one day I actually might go back and build something. But now it's probably too late for that. And it's also interesting how much architecture has been transformed in that period since I was a student. And I guess this is one of the topics tonight. So what can architecture do? Well, it is in many ways the most political of architectural forms. This is the famous example of the British House of Commons, which after World War II, when it was hit by an incendiary bomb, Churchill insisted on rebuilding exactly as it had been previously. And Churchill was a politician with a real skill of an actor or a theatre director, because he knew that it was important to maintain the form. He said famously, "We shape our buildings and then they shape us." But in the case of the House of Commons, he knew that most of the time the chamber will be empty, so it's carefully designed not to be large enough for every member of the parliament to have a seat, which makes it look slightly less empty when it's empty. And on really busy occasions, it's so full that it gets that sense of extra excitement. And of course, it was built after an architectural competition in the 19th century in which the national style was specified as Tudor Gothic. And the reason that the benches face each other is the historical one, that this was originally the chapel of a cathedral. The choir sat on stalls facing each other, and that was the birth of what was seen as this adversarial system of the government on one side and the opposition on the other. And it just shows how much politicians believe architecture is capable of everything, that when the Scots voted to build a parliament in Edinburgh and had a competition which was won by a Catalan architect, a very political choice, Enric Miralles, there was this kind of innocent belief that all it would take to make politicians be nicer to each other was to rearrange the furniture and put them in a nice friendly half circle rather than two sword lengths apart to stop them killing each other. So I guess I'm saying that architecture cannot do everything. In the case of Minoru Yamasaki, I'm really touched by this image, which shows this kind of very slight American-Japanese figure standing in front of the Twin Towers, the project that made his name, standing with that tiny model of the Twin Towers in his hand. An architect whose life was marked by two tragic projects that both ended in destruction. The Twin Towers, it's so curious, you know, that in his memoirs, Yamasaki said that he himself had a fear of heights, and that the structural system he adopted for the Twin Towers put the vertical structural members close enough together for them to hold his shoulders in place. It was the only way he could feel secure enough to come to the edge of his buildings. And for the person who was the architect of what was then the tallest building in the world to confess that they didn't like heights does seem as if the Pope decided he wasn't necessarily a believer in God. And this was the other project which Yamasaki had his name always attached to in the Pruitt-Igoe flats in St. Louis. His name is attached to them, but probably this is not the design as he'd have wanted it. And this, of course, was the beginning of the idea that architecture was responsible for all our social ills. This was the project which allowed Charles Jenks to reprint this photograph and claim that it marked the end of the modern movement on the day in 1972 when this whole scheme was dynamited, having become uninhabitable. There's been a lot of revisionist history since then. You never see the pictures of the interiors and of what life might have been like there. And that really marked that moment when the architect was transferred from having been seen as some kind of social liberal, a hero who was responsible for trying to create a better new world, was suddenly identified with all the ills of the modern world. And in some ways, of course, it's much too simple to think it's the architect who is responsible for all those social problems and social difficulties. And I think we've also come to see those buildings rather differently. This is a before and after of a project in France in which social housing in more or less the same period as Pruet-Igoe was restored by Lacaton and Vassal, who took the view, and it's one which I think we all must share now, that you should, given the climate emergency, never demolish anything unless you really have to, but you work with the existing grain of a building to give it a more generous sense of space. And in the case of Lacaton and Vassal here, it's adding those balconies to the exterior. But that sense that architecture and how buildings looked was responsible for the things that went wrong with the world was a pervasive one, seen never more clearly than in the work of the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, to create this, in some eyes, utopian, in other ways, in other views, dystopian world of a community in Poundbury, in which trying to make buildings look old would somehow make the world a better place. Do we still believe that? I'm not sure. I'm not comparing King Charles with Stalin for one moment, but he was, of course, the architect of socialism. This painting was completed in 1941, just before World War II reached the Soviet Union. And in the background, you can see two key projects. One is the socialist realism architecture of the canal that Stalin had excavated linking Moscow to the coast, a project in which tens of thousands of prisoners were literally worked to death. And in the background is the monument on top of the Soviet pavilion at the French Expo in Paris in 1937, the famous image of the worker and the collective farm girl. And Stalin used, like Hitler, used architecture as a weapon. He believed that modernity and the language of avant-garde was too abstract for the Soviet working class. And rather in the manner of Donald Trump, who's telling us as a billionaire that America is run by elitists, Stalin felt that classicism was the language the working class could understand. And he set about remodeling Moscow once Lenin was out of the way and the capital had been moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow. He set about remodeling Moscow to demonstrate that socialism and the proletariat were there to stay. This was the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, built by the Tsars to commemorate a victory over Napoleon and the ill-fated French invasion of Russia. It was at one time the largest church in Moscow, if not even in Russia. And in 1931, Stalin decided that it had to go. He had it dynamited and set about which was no mean undertaking, required thousands of workers, the construction of a temporary railway. Fragments were still being removed 3 months later. And this was going to be the site of the Cathedral of Socialism, the Palace of the Soviets, designed allegedly by Boris Yofan, an architect who was not untalented, born in the Ukraine, of Jewish origin, who fell victim to the Russian quotas against Jews studying architecture in Russia. He had to go to Rome, where he joined the Italian Communist Party, married a half-Russian, half-Italian princess, got her to join the Communist Party, and then returned to Moscow in 1924, and began building fairly sane, rationalist architecture, and was commissioned by Stalin to run the competition to build the Palace of the Soviets, to design the Palace of the Soviets, which he was always meant to win. Yes, they paid Le Corbusier and Gropius to take part, but it was Yofan who was destined to win. once he won, of course, Stalin says, you have won. However, I have a few conditions to your fairly rational scheme. I want it to be made a lot taller. In fact, I want it taller than the Empire State Building. And I also want Lenin on top, who has got to be larger than the Statue of Liberty, which basically meant it was going to be unbuildable. However, having gone to New York to learn how the Americans were building the Rockefeller Center using steel construction, he set off. Jofan's largest completed project is in this image on the other side of the Moscow River, the so-called house on the embankment, the megastructure which had apartments for the party elite, department stores, cinemas, restaurants, a enclave of luxury in the Soviet system, and you could watch his building begin to take shape on the other side of the river, and this is the steelwork in place. Famously, the house on the embankments was also known in the Soviet Union as the house of preliminary detention. It was where something like 300 of the 900 residents ended up in the gulags. But Jofan, on the basis of doing exactly what Stalin told him, survived to the ripe old age of 85 and lived till 1976. The trouble with working for a dictator is that once they are evicted, or once they die in office, which is what Stalin did, when Khrushchev took over the country, he objected not only to Stalin's economic policies, but also to his architectural tastes. So Khrushchev had the foundation pit for the Palace of the Soviets turned into what was the largest open-air swimming pool in Moscow, particularly amazing in winter, actually, when it was heated and steam rose over it. A memorable experience it must have been. But the story, of course, does not end there. Architecture is a very symbolic means of signaling what a regime is doing. And the first post-Soviet mayor of Moscow, deeply corrupt individual, managed to persuade the central government to unlock the funds to rebuild the cathedral more or less as it had been. And so this is Pussy Riot protesting at the connections between the Orthodox Church and Putin. The original church actually saw Tchaikovsky performing the 1812 overture. So from Tchaikovsky to Pussy Riot, but the same architecture is quite a nice story. And this was that confrontation between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. On my left is the German pavilion by Speer. On the right is Boris Jofan's half-deco, half-suprematist Soviet pavilion. Speer always claimed that he got a sneak preview of the Soviet design and made his building appropriately taller. You have to hand it to Speer. He was smart enough, very rarely, to be photographed wearing a Nazi uniform, and perhaps that helped him survive the Nuremberg trials with only a jail sentence. It's not only the Soviets that do that kind of thing. This is Berlin's city palace, as it was, and this is what happened in 1948 when the DDR was founded. And allegedly, the palace was in such bad condition that it had to be cleared away. Of course, another version of that is that it needed to be erased to make way for a parade ground at the center of the DDR. There was one fragment was kept. This is the House of Ministers in Berlin, and this fragment of the old palace was re-erected. This was the balcony from which Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht declared the German Democratic Republic, so it was seen as having earned its keep. And next to it was built on the site of the Royal Palace, the Palace of the Republic, with East Germany managing to show that it was just as modern as anything that Dallas could do, with orange mirror glass and fantastic motor cars in the foreground. And this was, of course, a building which many East Germans remember with some affection, as well as a parliament. Inside it had a bowling alley, a discotheque, restaurants in which you could actually use East German marks rather than hard currency. But reunification brought about, it became redundant. Perhaps the interior now would have definitely made it into wallpaper and all those 1960s enthusiasts. It's amazing how our taste buds have changed so much. That period has gone from being eyesore to heritage so quickly. But this, I think, was perhaps the most interesting moment in the Palace of the Republic's life. After Parliament moved out, it became a found art space. This was one art installation which involved flooding the interior. But of course, very much like what happened with the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, we now have the Humboldt Forum, which has carefully reconstructed the palace facade as the prelude to a mixed cultural space. The meanings of buildings do change over time. This is in Sarajevo, originally designed at the time of the Austro-Hungarian takeover of Bosnia-Herzegovina, actually by a Czech architect. And those of you who've not been to Sarajevo, it's a fascinating triple city which has at its heart an Ottoman core with hammams, a marketplace, mosques, actually very beautiful ones. And then Austro-Hungary took over in the 19th century and promptly built Vienna, more or less. And then around that, after socialism, Tito built Yugoslav-style socialism all around it. So this building, by a Czech architect who somehow believed that because this was an Islamic Turkish city, somehow Moorish Arab architecture was the most appropriate thing to build what was the city hall. So a very strange piece of colonialism became the city library and archive, which during the appalling bloodshed of the Civil War was set on fire by Serbs and burnt, and now it's been reconstructed as a post-war symbol. So this is a colonial artifact becomes something very different. And buildings' meanings do have the possibility to change. They're not fixed. Henry Russell Hitchcock was, with Philip Johnson, the curator of the international style exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. I'm not expecting to read this, but he was, you could say he and Johnson between them invented modernity for America. And after the war, he was asked by a British architectural magazine, the Architectural Review, to do a piece about what he thought was the future of architecture. And he said the time of the geniuses, well, the time of worrying about style is now less important. As he saw it, there were two kinds of architecture going forward. There's what he called the architecture of bureaucracy and the architecture of genius. And he was careful to point out that what he didn't mean was that one was in somehow better than the other. He didn't understand bureaucracy as being characterless, but he did think it was all about scale and size, and offices in future would be either very small in about the personality of an individual or hugely over-organized. And here is Henry Russell with Philip Johnson, who would definitely have seen himself as being in the genius camp. This was the catalogue they did with one of Czechoslovakia's great buildings in Brno, and that exhibition, which was hugely influential. And that is the exhibition itself. And it is extraordinary how some exhibitions sort of mark architectural turning points. Something like 5,000 people saw this show, and yet we're still talking about it. People run symposia about it. They worry about who actually got in, who didn't get in. And it was the start of Johnson's very successful career, and this rather extraordinary moment when suddenly architecture became very visible. And shortly afterwards, another great architectural patron set about the foundation stone ceremony of a project which luckily never happened. Philip Johnson described Trump as a genius, and Trump actually called Johnson a genius as well. I think that's Mayor Giuliani in the foreground. But what was Henry Russell Hitchcock talking about? Well, Yes, he meant old-style monsters like Frank Lloyd Wright, here with Solomon Guggenheim and Hiller Ribe, the extraordinary German artist who moved to America at the time of the recession and persuaded Guggenheim to trade in his old masters for abstract expressionism, and insisted that Frank Lloyd Wright was hired to design this monument, which was so antithetical to art that when it opened in 1950, whatever it was, there was a petition to the New York Times signed by a dozen New York artists, including Robert Rauschenberg, suggesting that a building which was both circular and with a floor that tilted would be impossible to show art in. And Wright would take no opposition. The first director of the Guggenheim did his best to try and salvage the system of showing art with this complicated system of wires and cables and rods to make flat canvases project from the curved wall. He really managed to annoy Johnson, who wrote to the trustees denouncing him as a former corset salesman, and it was time to sack him and get another museum director in. You can see how happy that would have made me. The master from Switzerland who moved to Paris helped the church modernize themselves. There was a fascinating Dominican priest, Father Couturier, who was responsible for, well, he believed that the Catholic Church had lost the ability to make authentic religious art or architecture. And he began by, well, he got Le Corbusier to do Ronchamp and this monastery at La Tourette. But his first project was a chapel at Saint Paul de Vence, in which he began with an artist, Henri Matisse, and having persuaded Matisse to take on what began as the job of doing the vestments and some of the art inside, Couturier offered Matisse his choice of architect, and he said, "I'm sure I could get Le Corbusier to do it for you." And Matisse said, "I want an architect who will do what I want, not what they want." And this was the great example that Henry Russell Hitchcock talked of in the idea of the architect as bureaucrat. This is Adam Kahn, who was responsible for building some of the huge car factories in Detroit. And this was how he organized his studio, so he could actually build factories in double quick time. And this was what his drawing office looked like. This was the kind of thing that he built very quickly, very efficiently, very affordably, very organizedly. And the arsenal of democracy, which was the tank factories in Detroit. And there was another less intimidating version of that, which was the idea that in Britain, in Northern Europe, I guess in the Czechoslovak Republic for a while, the idea of an architect's highest mission was to work for the state or for the city. So this was the Greater London Council, where I actually spent 3 months, being even less competent than I was with Chamberlain, Powell and Bon. And this is actually Frank Lloyd Wright visiting the architect's office in London at the time that they were working on the Festival Hall. Allegedly, when he made his visit, his only words about the Festival Hall were, "Have you guys ever designed one of these before?" But that was a period which is now so far behind us, when society believed in building cultural buildings, in building schools. These are all examples from the Great London Council. This is a school that's now been demolished. This was the new town of Thamesmead within London. It became famous when Stanley Kubrick filmed scenes of Clockwork Orange here. This was the Roehampton Flats, London's tribute to Le Corbusier. This is Alexandra Road, actually not London County Council, but Camden. And it's, I was talking earlier about the Palace of the Republic. The way that these, as if a mental switch in our heads was suddenly pushed from on to off, or off to on, in the same way that Victorian architecture in Britain was once seen at best as a joke for insiders. The architecture of the 1960s has gone from being seen as all that was wrong with life to being something that we want to hold on to. And you can see why that sense that the community invests in housing, that it invests in schools, it invests in hospitals, seems very reassuring in the difficulties that many societies now find themselves. I guess this is my version of the architecture of bureaucracy. When I was a student, 30 was huge. In this photograph, if you look carefully, you will spot Richard Rogers with some hair, and Norman Foster with less hair. Sue Rogers is on Norman Foster's lap, and Wendy Cheeseman, who became the first Mrs. Foster, is sitting on Richard's lap. And that was the start of what became, in Norman's case, an office of 1,500 people now. And I mean, that was only halfway. That was Norman Foster's office 10 years ago. You couldn't take that picture anymore. You need a drone to do it. And you can see how this is when Norman's office was tiny. This is Buckminster Fuller with Norman, with Tony Hunt, the engineer. They're talking about a project that Buckminster Fuller had to build an underground theatre in Oxford. And he came to Norman with the idea of that was his model on the table. And his idea was that it would be like a bar of soap sunk underneath the courtyard of an Oxford college. Never happened. And that was what the rest of the office looked like, all that paper. Actually, Jan Kaplický worked here for a bit, and also here, again at a time when architectural offices still had drawing boards. And that's Foster's office now, which is only a fraction of his workforce. And you have to, it's now clear that an office of this size can do things that our older idea about an architecture built around one individual can't do. And you'd have to say that what Foster has done is to enormously raise the standard of architecture. In a way, he's erased the difference that Britain and America once had between the kind of architecture that architecture critics like me used to write about, which is mostly universities, art galleries, and libraries, and commercial architecture, which is all the rest. And now that barrier has really dissolved. But I love the idea of looking at how the amount of information that architects need to produce around a project has changed over the years. So this is Michelangelo, in itself an extraordinary work of art as a drawing, and a set of instructions which was pretty much all that the masons working to make that would need to execute it. But that might be also useful. Or this is Christopher Wren's own sketch for how you might construct the Dome of St. Paul's. And drawings do say so much about an architect. We writers can hide behind our word processors, but drawings really are extraordinarily intimate. They show the handwriting and the thinking. And it's the way that they communicate. And throughout architectural history, architects have always relied on people to interpret their work in ways that people who are not architects can understand. So this is Joseph Gandy, who worked for Sir John Soane, the architect of the Bank of England, and many other great works of architecture. And for him, this was a tribute to his employer, but also the kind of technique that he developed to present drawings that could be understood by those who were going to pay for them and build them. And this was Gandy's extraordinary imagining of the Bank of England. It's often described as being done as if the bank was actually a ruin, but there's another view which says that it was simply a way to explain the internal layout and spaces and how one space gave way to another. And this was Alfred Waterhouse. Drawings become more elaborate. More is needed to explain the complexity of a building. And yet there's still, this is, I guess, the very first of those famous series of drawings in which the architect dashes off as a drawing which is the beginning of the building on the back of a boarding card or the back of a menu. This was Joseph Paxton's sketch for what became the Crystal Palace. There was a competition to build this temporary structure for the world's first expo. Paxton was a judge in the competition, didn't rate much of the any of the entries, so he said, okay, I'll do it. Obviously don't enter a competition in which you're a judge like that on the jury. But this, 6 months later, that sketch to turn into this building. And maybe this is the kind of end of the era of drawing. This is a series of drawings that Helmut Jacobi, a German architect who became the great delineator, did for Norman Foster. Jacobi, at one stage, was in New York working for Paul Rudolph and Philip Johnson and Marcel Breuer simultaneously on drawings for the same competition entries, and basically went nuts, returned to Germany, had been sick of all this cross-hatching. Norman found him and commissioned him to do a series of drawings for him. And Norman was really interesting about it. He told me that you think that you do drawings to seduce a client, but he said that he worked with Jacobi to interpret the drawings before it was too late, to give them a sense of what it would really be like when it was finished. So it would be time, there would be time to change it if necessary. So Norman called Helmut Jacobi a critical friend, which I found was really interesting, and something that the increasingly sophisticated change of technology in drawing actually doesn't give us. And maybe Zaha Hadid also was one of the last generation to draw herself. I don't mean herself, to draw with her own hands. This is, such a beautiful sketchbook. There's such magic images. And this was the project that should have been the start of her building career in Britain, the Cardiff Bay Opera House. My part in her downfall was that I was commissioned by the client to do an exhibition in Cardiff showing the scheme, which was meant to be a coronation. Everyone didn't quite work out that way. And this, I guess, was a design tool, in the way that Zaha saw space. This was one of the images for the Hong Kong Peak competition. And in the same way, this is part of Mariah's submission for the Edinburgh Parliament, completely baffled the jury by giving them this collage of a piece of grass that he'd found on the site. But all that's in the past now, and there is now no need for those seductive artist renderings, because we can use VR and digital modeling to produce things that will give us a fly-through or give the client a fly-through, which removes that element of shock and surprise that the building has the first time the first time the client sees it. It began with Geary and Bilbao, but an architectural studio now is such a different thing and involves such weird stuff going on. And it's produced another world. This is an image of a building planned for Ho Chi Minh City by Ole Sheeran, who was once Rem Koolhaas's partner. And it's that crossover between the digital world and the physical world, which seems to me also to belong to the world of video games. This is a still from Grand Theft Auto, I think it's 5. The next one, 6, is coming out. I'm not a video gamer, but there is something extraordinary about the endless worlds that can now be created with this. And the techniques, the modeling techniques, are very much the same as those used by an architectural office now, and as is some of the language and some of the experiences that these spaces have to offer. And we're dealing with 3D printing, which is sooner or later going to change the way that we build things. I'm not sure about swarming drones constructing walls, but you never know. I also always think that though everything has changed, some things don't change. How do architects get work? Well, they publish books about themselves, and that began with Vitruvius, and it involved Palladio, who was basically producing a pattern book like this. Well, I can do one for you in any color you want. And you'd have to say that this is very much the same phenomenon with a studied use of a very different graphic style, but it is the way that people communicate. A big fat book has become an essential part of the architect's repertoire. I always think it's strange how Koolhaas, who is one of the most intelligent, smart, shrewd architect of his generation, with the real ability to write incisively, and who had the basically subversive idea of starting an office called the Office for Metropolitan Architecture with Elia Zengelis, which is gently mocking, I think, the corporate system, has somehow managed to produce an office which has become a production line for genius architects, most of whom are male, in fact all of whom are male, and mostly have not much hair and produce very large fat books and produce monumental architecture of this scale. Here's a local version, and here's a project that the two of them are working on, that Heatherwick and Ingalls are working on in London. Big by name, big by nature. This is the King's Cross development, and that's the Google headquarters. Made to look as small as possible here. Actually, it's the size of an aircraft carrier, and may or may not house 2,000 people, depending on whether Google go on cutting their workforce in the UK. Architecture can be that, or it can be Alejandro Arenas, and housing, affordable housing in Chile. The idea here is that how do you build affordable housing for people who can't afford it? Well, you build as little as possible and give them the chance to extend it later. Or architecture can be Francis Kéré working in Africa, or architecture can be this group from Brussels who are taking climate change extremely seriously and have set up their own builder's yard, making their own building blocks, recycling materials, using them in their own projects and creating employment. Or architecture can be Eyal Weizmann's project Forensic Architecture, which uses, Weizmann is a fascinating character. He trained at the Architectural Association, worked in Berlin, where he worked on a very sensitive restoration project for a long demolished synagogue. But in his time at Goldsmiths College in London, he set up a unit which uses architectural techniques to explore crimes, mostly war crimes, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Israel, in Argentina, and Mexico. Or architecture can be Assemble, a British group which includes architects and artists and makers and craftsmen who see their role not as telling their clients what to do, but by embedding, I suppose you would say, with communities, particularly in deprived communities, to work with them to make things happen. Or architecture can be Herzog and de Meuron, who maybe I take a slightly romantic view, but I think they managed to create a very interesting synthesis of ideas-led architecture with having a good time, and also the courage or the confidence. Too many architects believe that when they work with an artist, it's their job to put art in a box and safely sanitize it. You'd have to say that with Ai Weiwei and various other artists they've worked with, Herzog and de Meuron have the confidence to allow their work to be contaminated and infiltrated by art and by artists. But they're also very interested in materiality. None of their buildings are the same. I think they're always looking for a fresh take on something. Maybe architects' great tragedy is that either they have too much work, in which case they parody themselves, or too little work, in which case they spend too much time on a small project. I think Herzog and de Meuron have managed to come some way through the middle of that. But in this increasingly digital world, there's something about their interest in using materials from adobe and mud to gabions and stone to ceramics that I find really seductive. Or architecture is still authoritarian leaders who believe they can build an instant city. This is the line. Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia's plans for what is described as a city that will house 9 million people within 25 years, 170 kilometers long, made up of 2 parallel lines of skyscrapers 500 meters high. I would point out that the population of Saudi Arabia at the moment is something like 38 million, so it's not entirely clear where these extra 9 million are going to come from, and it's not entirely clear what it's going to be like inside these 2 parallel lines of skyscrapers 500 meters high, about as far apart as the Champs-Élysées is wide. There's several architects working on this project whose work I really respect. They all had to sign non-disclosure agreements that were so terrifying that it would actually sacrifice your children's children if you broke it. And then this confidentiality was somewhat undermined when an exhibition in Riyadh showed photographs of all of them. And they include Peter Cook, they included Rem Koolhaas, they included David Adjaye, and most of all, Tom Mayne. And I just found myself wondering, why would an architect spend that amount of time and energy on a project that clearly will not be realized in the manner to which, I mean, fragments of this are certainly going to be built. There are earth movement equipment, there are camps in the desert of people actually building this stuff as we speak. But there's unlikely to be a high-speed railway line underneath it, shipping people from one end to the other. And the stuff in the brochures about how it's designed to be energy neutral and to encourage cycling. I mean, given the Saudi Arabian climate, I think cycling is even less likely than flying taxis is going to be there. But yeah, so I compared, I mean, why would you spend time, given limited lifespan, on a building which is not going to be realized? Well, obviously, the money helps. And there's something about Tom Mayne and Peter Cook spending their time on this that reminds me of a heavy metal band from the 70s, regrouping for the sake of their pension funds. Or architecture can be this. This is an image by the Office of Hassel, a practice that's based in both Australia and in London. This project is led by Javier de Castellier, which is exploring how we might live on the moon using all those 3D printing techniques that we were exploring earlier on. The problem about the moon, of course, is that it's a climate which is even less appealing than Antarctica. The radiation is so rough that it will actually kill astronauts unless they're protected. So the deal here is that this is funded by the European Space Agency, incidentally, and it's for a community of up to 144 people. So phase 1 is the free enterprise rockets owned either by Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, blast up here, bringing with them fleets of robotic 3D printers that will be solar powered. They would shift the moon's soil surface to form a protective mound on a inflatable formwork, and then when that was finished, might take 3 months, you'd build you set up another inflatable living pod inside it, detonate that, and then eventually fill it. What's quite sweet about de Castellier is, like so many architects, he's a storyteller. So what he's thought of here is that, yes, you're going to need some kind of social life if you're not going to go mad with the isolation and that community. So you need a bar. And his bar is going to be furnished with things that they find on the moon already, like the seats on the moon buggies that are still there, having been left since 1972. And there's bits of Saturn rocket in here. And he'd also have a greenhouse, solar-powered, where you would actually use plastic waste to grow mycelium to make soft furniture out of. So what can architecture do? An awful lot. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Please allow me ask you one short question.
Did you say a trick question?
One short question, no trick. I wouldn't touch you. You mentioned that design is something how to understand the world, and we are in the era when we know that more than 50% of people or the population of Earth will live in cities in the future, and so it means that the design of cities is very important. How do you say that design will be important in understanding cities? What will be the important detail? What will be the important part of the design of cities that will help us to understand how should people live there?
Well, I mean, how should people live there is a bit like telling them what to do, and I think the starting
Not
point
telling
is,
them what to do, but to make them make
there is no
cities
should.
livable.
I mean, so you see, I don't think that design is the thing. Design is a method. It's a technique. So a city is made by many, many people, different kinds of people. They range from the people that design roads to the people that the lawyers that write property leases, which has a massive impact on what you can actually do and build, to the people that lend money for mortgages, to politicians who have a very short event horizon. Things have to happen before the next election, otherwise they're not worth doing. Architects, citizens, and those are not people that necessarily spend enough time talking to each other, and they speak different languages. And I guess that the point about a place like camp is to provide a safe ground where these different groups might communicate with each other. I think, and there's so many ways to understand cities. I often feel humbled. I think that the best way to, the best interpretations of cities have been movie makers. If you want to understand Los Angeles, a combination of Chinatown, which is all about the water supplies, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is all about the petrol companies evilly buying up the streetcar system and shutting it down, tell you all you need to know. And I think 19th century novelists are even more important. Dickens said so much about what London was like in the 19th century. Zola, the same with Paris. People like me just write long postcards.
Maybe one little thing. You have shown us some, we say, star architects.
Never use that word.
Do you think that we are in an era where architects are more, closer to ordinary people, closer to their real lives and trying to understand them?
Look, there's still clearly a sense that architecture is a religious calling, that you have to wear the right outfit and that nothing else matters at all, and that you spend, and it starts at college and you work all night. I do remember Norman Foster once describing his time at Yale, and he was a student of Paul Rudolph, and when he and Richard Rogers were there was one all-night session, and Rudolph came into the studio, I think it was at something like 6 a.m., and Norman was asleep, and Rudolph woke him up and said, "The trouble with you, Norman, is that you don't care enough." And I think Norman cried, but that sense that architecture is so all-pervasive is wrong, and I think it's what's actually made it a very masculine profession, one in which maybe 50-50 gender equality at college, but until quite recently, women fell away, which is really terrible. And I think there is now a more humane attitude. The way that we educate architects is no longer quite so confrontational, I mean, there was the kind of the torture of the crit, where you're expected to stand up and defend your work in front of people who are there mostly to show off to their colleagues rather than to educate people, and that doesn't fly anymore. So maybe it's becoming a gentler. Maybe it's becoming gentler.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Deyan Sudjic.